And away we go.
All right. Welcome to the Pandemic Baseball Zoom/podcast/book club on the internet. We are here to promote one another's work, to spread the gospel of baseball books in a land with no baseball. This is Eric Nusbaum, and I'm here to interview Jason Turbow, the author of Bled Blue, which came out last year and has just been released in paperback. And I'm really excited about this because it is rare for somebody who writes a book like me to then get to interview somebody whose book so beautifully pairs with it thematically. I'm going to describe the pairing of our books as beautiful today.
Beautifully thematic.
Beautifully thematic. And your book is beautifully thematic. So let's get right into talking about Bled Blue and the man on the cover, Fernando Valenzuela. What was your sort of opinion as an outside, or not a Dodger fan like I grew up, about Fernando before you set off on this mission?
My opinions about Fernando were very much in line with my opinions about the rest of the Dodgers, which is to say I was a preteen and teenage Giants fan,
Sure.
which is also to say that my team was terrible and those Dodgers teams were great. So there was a lot of kind of underlying resentment from the fanhood side. Beyond that, I didn't know a lot. I knew he was groundbreaking as far as Mexican baseball players go, but I didn't know the backstory of Chavez Ravine beyond, the broad strokes of it. So the chance to kind of dig into it more and understand exactly how important he was to the community in Los Angeles was kind of astounding. I mean, I learned a lot about all these players, but I certainly learned far more about Fernando than anybody else. And I think it works nicely in concert with your book, Stealing Home, which you can actually see on the mantle behind you next to my book.
Yes.
Which is fantastic, between Pooh and Tigger.
You see how similar our books look, both with white and blue covers and big blue font on them.
Mine are not propped up by toys, but then again, I don't have a child napping as we speak like you do.
He just woke up, so he's being quiet in the other room right now, at least for now. Maybe we'll see him later.
If we have a guest starring appearance, that's all good. So, I learned about Chavez Ravine. I learned about Fernando, and my trick, because this story was not about Chavez Ravine, as is yours, was how much depth to give it as a subject, with deference to the fact that the story was about the entire Dodgers team in 1981. So I needed to kind of condense that backstory into a very vital portion of Fernando's history and explaining Fernando. But it's really nice to kind of go through your book and see the depth of everything I've endeavored to condense as much as possible.
It's funny because then when I read that chapter in your book, I was like, oh man, I could have just written this in one chapter. You got everything in there, and it was only in like 4 or 5 pages. The thing that interests me about Fernando, especially in your book, is that he comes off both as this sort of complete character, but also how much of a cipher he is even to his teammates. You do this thing in the book where you have these little vignettes, right? An important moment in Dusty Baker's career is happening in his season, and then you drop back and you give us Dusty Baker in a few pages and a little bio. But with Fernando, there's the bio, and you get the strokes about his life in Mexico and the kind of amazing mythology of how he got his screwball, which we'll talk about in a second. But every time you have somebody else talking about Fernando, whether it's Sosha or Royce or whoever it is, it's like, yeah, we didn't really know what was going through his head. He's sort of a mystery even to the people who are closest to him, his catcher.
Yeah, it's true. And part of it was that he spoke almost no English. We're talking about 1981 when he had just gotten called up. He'd spent a couple months in Lodi. And other than that, his whole life had been in Mexico. He's in Lodi as a minor leaguer. He spoke very little English. His teammates spoke very little Spanish. Sosha spoke a little bit. Dusty Baker spoke some Spanish. Tommy Lasorda spoke some Spanish. But even they and his Hispanic teammates couldn't crack him. I mean, he just didn't have a lot to say, which is amazing. His closest confidants, Mike Brito, the guy who not only signed him but housed him for much of the 1981 season, was like, he kept to himself. He was quiet, and I had to drag words out of his mouth when I asked him questions. I mean, according to Brito, when he first went down to scout him as a 17-year-old in Mexico, Valenzuela, Brito said, "Hey, I'm here from the Los Angeles Dodgers." And he's like, Fernando didn't care. Right? He was cold as ice. Like, I had to drag answers out of him as a guy who potentially wanted to give him lots of money to come to America. That's just how quiet he is.
Which is amazing too, because Brito is super loquacious. Like, that guy has a lot to say about everything.
Yes.
And if you get him started on a topic, like, I think I've caught him in a scrum once or twice and just asked him one question, and then I'll be standing there for 15 minutes while he just kind of gives you every detail. And the kind of odd couple pairing of this older Cuban scout and Fernando's is kind of one of the beautiful little relationships that dots They Bled Blue, to me at least.
Yeah, it is. I mean, there's no question that Brito loves the guy, and Fernando, for all his reticence to speak, is a pleasant fellow, right? He still works for the Dodgers all these years later. He's a broadcaster, so he's stuck around the club, and he's well loved by everyone, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, actually, this is not the question I was going to ask next, but you mentioned Fernando still works for the Dodgers. Mike Brito is still around the Dodgers. He's no longer the radar gun guy, but he is around. There's a lot of people in this book who are still deeply connected with the Dodger organization. And there's a lot of players on this team, the 81 Dodgers, who are not, and who you kind of open the book talking about Don Sutton and his acrimonious breakup with the team. And the Dodgers and Don Sutton don't really have a connection still, even though he's one of the greatest pitchers in Dodger history. Reggie Smith had an acrimonious separation with the team. I'm not sure if he's back in their good graces. A lot of these guys who kind of were big parts of the history of the Dodgers sort of went their separate ways. Obviously, Socha didn't get the job as a manager of the Dodgers. He became the manager of the Angels. Baker never managed the Dodgers. He becomes a manager of the Giants. I mean, what do you think it is about this team in particular and the Dodger organization that led to these sort of very strong connections and then these strong, I guess, ugly breakups that were happening at the time?
That's a really interesting dichotomy. I think the Dodgers have a very firm sense of what they want from an organizational standpoint. And those players with aspirations beyond the playing field, for by and large, didn't fit that framework. Bill Russell did. He was Lasorda's guy. He ended up managing the Dodgers as Lasorda's hand-picked successor. Dusty Baker, for whatever reason, did not fit that model, partly because they soured on him toward the end of his playing career and kind of chased him out of town. He's still pretty bitter about that. Lots of rumors about drug use started swirling in Los Angeles just before they released him, on his huge contract that he signed. And, he still feels those rumors were started by the team as a way of softening the blow that they knew was going to come. They were trying to make the PR hit a little easier for them. So he held some grudges, justifiably, as far as I can tell. And Reggie Smith had his issues. Beyond that, I don't really know. I mean, it was a big difference for me in researching this book with the players than it was during my previous book about the swinging A's of the 70s. Those A's were all wide open. They were open books. They talked about anything and everything. Partly, I think, because their legacies are intrinsically tied with the legacy of that team. Except for Reggie Jackson, they are all known mostly as members of the A's. Rollie Fingers had a career elsewhere. He's still, as a Hall of Famer.
I still think of him as an Oakland A. I mean, to me, when I see Rollie Fingers in my head, it's Oakland A's Rollie Fingers.
Yeah, and down the roster, it just gets the connection is stronger and stronger. Those guys are A's, and if they're not, if the team is underserved in the historical record, then they as players are underserved. In contrast, so many of these Dodgers either still work for the team or still live in the Los Angeles area and are around the stadium all the time, that they didn't want to open up for kind of understandable reasons. Like why would Ron Say start talking smack about his old teammates when he knows he's going to see them at the ballpark within the next 4 or 5 weeks? Right? It makes sense. It made it a more difficult task for me, and I really kind of had to sit down for long stretches of time and pry very gently but firmly to get the information I got.
Did you find that certain players were willing to just go there and let it all out?
Yeah, and those, I think, were the guys who were not around the team quite as much as the rest of them. Daryl Thomas opened up.
Yeah.
But he's also the kind of guy to open up. I had great conversations with all of them, even the ones who were guarded. But I think the further you get from current associations with the ball club, the easier it is to kind of spill your guts.
Yeah, I was impressed at how much Dusty Baker would talk to you about the drug stuff and the drug rumors, considering that, he was either managing or probably trying to get a managerial job when you interviewed him. I don't know if this was during his time with the Nats or before that, but he was, and obviously now if baseball starts up again, he'll be managing the Astros. He's still in baseball, and he's this beloved figure in baseball now, and he's totally willing to be frank about what life was like in the 70s and 80s as a Major League Baseball player. And that's such a breath of fresh air for me.
Yeah, well, though, this is why people love Dusty, right? He is unyieldingly honest. He's very straightforward, and he's really confident in himself and who he is, right? He doesn't need to put on any airs one way or another to know who he is. And he spoke very frankly about, doing cocaine in the 70s. I think, again, part of this is that I think the rumors exceeded the reality. And part of his motivation was to at least get his opinion on the record to that end, that he tried cocaine. It was 1981. Virtually everybody tried cocaine. It was on the cover of Time magazine. It was the big thing to do. But it wasn't a problem for him.
Right.
There was no rumors at the time of it being a problem. There was no indication that his play suffered. I have no reason to believe it was ever a problem. Unfortunately for him, it was a problem for several of his teammates in ways that had nothing to do with him. So it is kind of a loaded topic, and he still addressed it.
Yeah, and he got, for those of you who have not read Bled Blue, it's interesting. It's super depressing the way that players like Baker and Bobby Castillo, non-white players, end up sort of taking the fall organizationally for Steve Howe's cocaine abuse, for example. And sort of you can see the wheels churning kind of behind the scenes in the Dodger front office as this stuff's playing out. And it's kind of tragic which guys end up getting the blame and sort of getting cast aside because of this.
Yeah, there was definitely racial overtones. And it's funny because, you hear in retrospect the impression of Al Campanis, the general manager, is so enduring based on his Nightline interview, in which he said that black players black people don't have the buoyancy to be managers. It was a stupid thing to say. Who knows how much he believed it, because many of his players, including minorities, loved the guy. That said, they all admit there were racial overtones to the drug rumors, and the black and Hispanic players who were doing cocaine were treated differently than the white players who were doing cocaine. And yeah, Dusty was to some degree kind of blamed for Steve Howe internally, even though Steve Howe was very capable on his own of developing an out of control drug problem. And in fact, Dusty was one of the guys really trying to help him.
Yeah, so Steve Howe, you write in the book, his drug problem really ballooned during the labor stoppage in the 81 season, right? There's the strike, baseball halts, and all these guys are left with nothing to do. You write that the Dodgers, for a few days, kind of practiced at USC, and then that sort of trailed off too. What do you think that would be like now for players if they were allowed to leave their house, theoretically? Since we're now in a similar situation in that there's no baseball, players can't get together and play. What does a Major League Baseball player do without Major League Baseball? It's a very, sort of big question. These guys are born and bred to do really one thing only.
Yeah, I think, pandemic aside, if you could leave your house, I would be willing to bet that you would see an influx of big leaguers at places like the Driveline headquarters up in Washington and
Yes.
Texas Baseball Ranch, and these training centers that are using high technology to help players develop in new and better ways. Like, it's the stuff they're doing in the off season, and now they could just focus on it full time. Back in 1981, they literally just brought some baseballs and bats and gloves to a random field in central Los Angeles until that got too boring for them and they all went their own ways.
Yeah, you had Jay Johnstone hitting in his dad's garage in Riverside or something like that.
Yeah. I can't remember if it's in the book, but he told me, I went to my dad's garage because I had a really nice garage and I didn't want to wreck it.
Yeah, hey, that's fair. That's like the 81 version of did you see the video of Joey Gallo hitting in his ridiculous condo, with a super fancy driveline type setup in his living room.
Exactly. So I don't know if they'd invented bonnets in 1981, but I'm guessing he was just hitting balls into the rear wall of the garage over and over and over.
It's hard to imagine Jay Johnstone, as he comes off in this book, and in general as this kind of baseball clown, like working hard and trying. But he was a serious baseball player in addition to being, the guy who's unzipping his teammate's belt underneath the camera during an interview.
Yeah. I mean, Johnstone was funny. I sat down with him, and so much of his legacy is as the practical joker. And I think he's really leaned into that over the years. That's pretty much all he wanted to talk to me about. And I had to steer him in a very concerted way toward other topics. But he really loves talking about the stories of the pranks he pulled. And he's written 2 or 3 books.
Yeah,
about that.
And that's like stretching that out to multiple books. It's a commitment.
It is, and he's taken to telling stories that he's heard around the league that have nothing to do with him. To kind of beef up the page count.
But I think that's a good segue into the storyteller in chief of this book, which is Tommy Lasorda, a person who I think I was impressed with how sympathetic and positive you were about Tommy in this book, because on the surface level, if you just show his actions as a manager and the things he says, he could come off like a crazy person. He could come off totally unglued and illogical and just like a maniac. But as you write it, there's a method to his madness, and he's still alive, but as a manager, he was a true genius at motivating people and kind of getting under their skin. Could you talk a little bit about the genius of Tommy Lasorda that's maybe unseen by the rest of us?
Yeah, I mean, I think the mania you're talking about with Tommy largely came about after 1981. So there wasn't a lot of reason for me to delve into that period of his life. And it was there beforehand too. He was not shy about rubbing people the wrong way. He had his methods of how he wanted things to be organized, and was not willing to harbor a lot of dissenting opinion. But you're right. He was kind of this genius motivator. He was as a manager in the low minor leagues before he had ever reached the big leagues. He was organizing his teams in ways that no one had ever heard of. The story that he likes to tell is about being assigned to manage the Greenville roster during spring training. Before he'd ever even been a minor league manager. He was just a scout at the time, just a couple years removed from his playing career. They were a single A team, and they're going to play the Dodgers triple A team in an intra-squad scrimmage. And he started telling them in their dugout on their own before the game how much the AAA manager, Preston Gomez, had been disdainful of them, how much smack he'd been talking, and you need to crush these guys like nobody's business. They're not worthy of being on the same field. And Lasorda says, I want you to go out and show those players who you are and prove to them that you're out to take their jobs. And that game was played in a very angry fashion, and Preston Gomez had no idea why the single A players were literally trying to take out his middle infielders with these crazy slides, when his guys were just trying to get a little work in on the spring afternoon. But that was Tommy Lasorda. He would use any tactic he could to motivate his players. His goal there was to seize the attention of his superiors, Fresco Thompson and Al Campanis, and it worked. I mean, he got a managerial spot soon enough. With a lot of these stories, and I do note this in the book, it's somewhat difficult to tell them in that their sole source is Tommy Lasorda himself. So with kind of these legendary pieces of lore, you just have to take them with a little bit of a grain of salt.
Okay, so that's actually something that you do in the book, is you kind of talk within the text about the line between what's true and what's myth with the Dodgers and with Tommy Lasorda. You use a lot of footnotes to do that. And your footnotes are not like academic footnotes, like you got to see the citation. I mean, sometimes they are doing that. For the most part, they're kind of little asides or kind of funny stories that don't quite fit the text. How did you arrive at that sort of, I wouldn't call it an aggressive, but I would call it the footnotes are a part of the book. They're not supplementary so much as I think they're necessary to Bled Blue. How did you kind of arrive at that formula for writing it?
It actually came about in my previous book, Dynastic, Bombastic, Fantastic, which I initially turned in, you might appreciate this, at 310,000 words.
What?
Which is ridiculous, admittedly, which is the size of, it's about a 950-page book.
That's Moby Dick.
It's really, really big. But there was so much detail that needed to be told. There's so much history of the Kansas City years and Charlie Finley and lots of things to be told. And suffice to say, it is now a normal-sized book because I had to cut virtually half of that copy from the text. There's some stories that were just so good that I wanted to include, but there's no way to shoehorn them in the actual narrative without completely disrupting the flow.
Mm-hmm.
And I give credit to my editor for that, who said, just stick this in a footnote. And that may have been a mistake on her part.
Little did she know that.
I took it to town, and it didn't count on the final word count.
Oh, do footnotes not count? That's a good trick.
Yeah, I mean, you can make them count, but you can also set it so they don't count.
I'm gonna keep that in mind if I get to write another book.
Yeah, and so I wrote a decent amount of footnotes for that book, and went into this one thinking, whatever doesn't fit in the narrative, I'll just stick in a footnote because there's lots of great stories. As I did it on a Word document, this is me coming clean to you, it looked fine. It seemed like a reasonable amount of footnotes. But as soon as I saw the PDF of the final copy, I'm like, oh my God, there's a lot of footnotes in this thing.
No, there's like multiple per page in a lot of cases. And the footnotes, like sometimes they have their own stories to them. It's not David Foster Wallace level, but it's pretty footnotey, especially for a baseball book. And some of the footnotes are just really funny too. I feel like you get to let some of your jokes out. Yeah,
well, that's really the motivation for many of them. Like, this is too funny not to use. And David Foster Wallace, holy cow. Infinite Jest, this is my experience reading Infinite Jest for both the first and second time. I've actually gone through it twice, if you can believe it.
That's two more than me.
You're tired. I've got 10 more minutes in me before I go to sleep. I've got 3 more pages before the end of the chapter. I can make it. And then you see a footnote, and the footnote is 9 pages long. It's just so defeating. So I
through it twice.
Out a little bit.
Well, your footnotes, I don't think any of them reach a full page. I think maybe a couple paragraphs at most at the bottom of the page. Who was your favorite player to talk to in the course of writing this book? Is there a player that you kind of grew to have more affection for or were surprised by?
Surprised by? Yeah, I would say I was surprised by Daryl Thomas. Daryl had a very interesting reputation around this team and around this league. He kind of has a rep as a dirty player from his playing days. I knew about that starting with the Baseball Codes, my book from 2010, when he had what it's called a deke, a decoy, a phantom tag with no ball in his glove. He threw it down on Gene Clines of the Pirates, forcing Clines into kind of this late awkward slide, and Clines really messed up his ankle in a bad way. There was no reason for Thomas to do that. And so my first introduction really to Daryl Thomas was talking to Gene Clines about how much he hated Daryl Thomas. Gene Clines happens to be a good friend of Dusty Baker. I mean, I talked to Clines when he was a coach under Baker with the Giants. And so I spent years with this image of Daryl Thomas in my head. And he'd come up in various baseball conversations with old players now and again. And the phrase Daryl is Daryl came up a lot, right? He was just his own guy. So I was expecting someone a little bit surly, a little bit standoffish. And he was open and great. We had a great conversation. He kind of let me inside about where he was at the time, where he is now, and really lent a lot to the book. I do think, kind of in contrast to your question, who surprised me, a lot of these guys are kind of exactly who you think they are. I interviewed Dusty a lot when he was manager of the Giants. I spent time with him at his house to talk about They Bled Blue up near Sacramento. I mean, luckily for me, this was between his Nationals gig and his Astros gig, so he had some time. And he is exactly who you think he is. He is so cool and so smart and so put together, and his direction is spot on. He knows exactly what he wants to say at all times. And he gave me more of that. It was a fantastic conversation. Steve Garvey is exactly who you think he is. He was incredibly giving of his time. We spent 5 hours sitting on his back patio talking about lots of different things. He was gracious. He was polite. And he was incredibly guarded, right?
It's interesting to me. Sorry to break up the Steve Garvey with more Steve Garvey. I don't think baseball fans now, even my generation of baseball fans, I was born in '86, appreciate how huge Steve Garvey was, and how kind of big of a star he was and how good of a player he was. I don't know why that is, but I think like something about Steve Garvey was so set in his era of when he played, and he was such a product of that time period that it almost doesn't translate to now.
Yeah, and I think the fact that his public image, which he had spent so many years so carefully cultivating, was just demolished shortly after his playing career.
Very, very quickly.
I think that has a lot to do with how embedded he is into the public consciousness right now. But he is now who he was then. And so when I would ask him about difficult things, and he would very politely say, "I don't want to talk about that," right? Which is exactly kind of how he handled it then. He gave endless time to reporters, but only talking about things that would perpetuate the image he wanted to perpetuate. Not lying. I mean, he wasn't a phony. His image was real. He was really that nice. He was really that giving as far as his time and meeting the kids, and as I say in the book, hugging the nuns and kissing the babies. That was Steve Garvey, but he was very, very conscious of his image.
That's interesting. And I guess in that way, he might have been ahead of his time. And like, a lot of the, most media-friendly athletes now are extremely controlled by team PR people in a way that they weren't, obviously, at the time Steve Garvey played. And they're very, aware of how they are perceived, even when it comes to like Kevin Durant tweeting back at people. You have athletes who just think about these things and are really conscientious about their image. And maybe, can you think of players before Steve Garvey who would have had that sort of instinct?
I'd have to think of them. I'm sure there have been. I think what set Garvey aside was how much his teammates resented him for it, because he could be a little sanctimonious about it. He let that divide separate him from the rest of the team, because it wasn't just that he wouldn't drink too much and he wouldn't curse and he was a nice guy. It was that he kind of looked down on those who would drink and did curse and would treat fans poorly, or whatever it was.
And he made it known how he felt.
Yeah, and that was, I had person after person tell me that was a hallmark of that team. People who were around the team, how much the rest of the team resented that facet of Garvey.
So when it comes to how you characterize these players in the book, I'm wondering how you strung along. It's one season, and you dip in and out of the season, right? You flash back to previous times in people's lives. You give us a lot of backstory about the Dodgers organization, about Chavez Ravine, about Fernando, about all these different players. How did you kind of decide when each player would get that microscope treatment, or when you would flash back? That seems like that would have been for me a huge challenge writing a book like this.
Yeah, I pretty much pinned it to something significant they did for the Dodgers in 1981, when it really made sense to kind of highlight their exploits in real time. I could then use that as a launching pad to jump backward in time to talk about who they were and how they got to that spot. Because as you know, it's impossible to tell a good story if you don't know everything about the characters they're in. And stealing home, it's mostly chronological, right? You do the exact same thing, but you start at the beginning of the various families, and it's not exactly along the same chronological timeline, but all your stories start at the beginning and end at the end, mixed up in between.
Yeah, no, it's totally chronological. And there was times I was thinking maybe it's other ways to tell the story. Maybe you could try something, you could do one story and then the other story, or whatever it is. But God, ultimately, chronological stories work. One thing happens and another thing happens and it follows, and the action leads to more action. And I think there's something natural about how we consume stories that's that way, and also how we consume sports.
Yeah, it's true. And if it was all backstory, then that gets boring, right? I don't want to read 50 pages of backstory unless there is story within that backstory. But I'll read a couple pages about a given player so I can understand him better before I get right back to the action. That seems reasonable.
Do you have a favorite backstory, like a weird like biographical fact that you uncovered that was like, that enlightens me about this person in a way that?
Well, yeah. The obvious answer, which you at this point know as much about as I do, is Fernando Valenzuela. Knowing that he grew up on this dusty truck farm in rural Mexico, and ended up pitching opening day for the Dodgers in 1981 as a 20-year-old, having been out of Mexico for less than a year. I mean, he didn't know anything about anything as pertaining to American culture. So learning where he came from really helped understand who he got to be. I think with Dusty, learning about his history in Riverside, in a very multicultural place, going to school with kids of all races, and then moving to Sacramento as a teenager and looking around and realizing the only two black faces in his school were his own and his brother's, and adjusting to that reality, I mean, helped him gain sight of who he eventually became as the great uniter, right? He was the one guy who united all the factions of that clubhouse, the Americans and the Latinos, and the black players and the white players, and even the pitchers and the hitters. Like, Dusty was the conduit between everybody.
Do you think looking back on it now, makes sense that Dusty and Scioscia were the guys who ended up becoming the kind of long-term iconic managers?
It makes sense. I mean, Scioscia, it makes sense for any catcher, really, right?
Sure,
Catchers have to be so involved, and Scioscia was smarter than your average catcher. I got to see that about Dusty because by the time he reached the Dodgers, he had already had a very significant career. My research on Scioscia goes up to his second season in the big leagues.
Yeah, that's fair.
I haven't delved too far into how managerial he got on the field, but it is not difficult to see why that was.
Yeah, I mean, even the way he talks about, I mean, who knows, he was a rookie, but the way he talks about things then makes it seem like, wow, for like a 22-year-old catcher, catching a guy like Fernando Valenzuela, catching Bert Hooton, who's hilarious as a character. I mean, I didn't know much about him other than he was a pretty good pitcher, but Happy Hooton is like one of the delights of the book to me. And also the way that his weight loss was covered, like by the kind of the media at the time, just like deeply insensitive.
Oh my God! I in the book, I can't remember the exact phrase, but they called him like a blubbery whale in the team yearbook.
Yeah, you said. I think it was. I just looked back at it. It was in a footnote, and I think it was from a blubbery whale to a shark in one off season or something like that. Oh man.
Yeah, they were ruthless. They were ruthless. That's
like Lasorda seeing him eating a baked Alaska at a restaurant and losing his mind and making him walk home. You know, the kinds of things that would definitely not happen now in a major league clubhouse.
Yeah, and that happened in the Dominican Republic, I think. Like that was in winter ball, and Lasorda had been, thirsting after Bert Hooton for a long time, ever since he came out of college.
Who hasn't thirsted after Bert Hooton every once in a while?
It's true. And he finally got him on his winter ball team while Hooton still pitched for the Cubs, and he's like, "Oh man, this is not going to work." And he got him slimmed down. It worked.
And the way he got him on the winter ball team is great too, because he goes up to him during batting practice when Hooton's playing for the Cubs, and Hooton had come to the majors as this highly touted, Texas superstar pitcher, and he had a great rookie year, and it just got worse and worse for a few years for him. And Lasorda basically says, "So why do you stink so much?" He doesn't even introduce himself. He just walks up to him and just asks him what happened.
Yeah, that was Tommy's way, and it actually, that goes a long way toward illustrating the importance of organization, right? Hooton signed with the Cubs, and he started off great, and then he had the succession of managers and the succession of pitching coaches who all had him do different stuff, and pretty soon he was not pitching to his strengths, and he was struggling mightily. He had, personality conflicts, I think, with maybe Leo DeRocher. It was not good for him. And then he got to the Dodgers, and it was just Tommy. And Tommy unleashed Hooton in a way that was unbelievably effective.
I think that's interesting too, especially at the time. Now we have baseball teams that seem like they're all, for the most part, kind of following the same standard best practices, right? They all have the same stats. They all have mostly the same ideas about player development. Maybe some teams are faster than others about adopting new ideas. We could talk to Jared Diamond about that. But the difference between the two organizations at the time was so huge. The cultural difference, the amount of resources that they would put into developing players, the coaching styles between the Dodgers and the Cubs or the Astros, who are kind of the great nemesis for the most part in this book. It's a big difference.
Yeah. I mean, it started with Branch Rickey. I mean, look at Vero Beach, Dodgertown. He was the first one to get his own location. And suddenly there were 600 or 700 minor leaguers. It wasn't just for the big league club. 600 or 700 minor leaguers in color-coded uniforms who were being organized by color and number and just running through drills all day, every day. And they figured out how to surface the best of them.
It really worked. That's how they got Tommy Lasorda to be a manager too, right?
It's true. I mean, and Tommy, the story with Tommy goes, he was acquired, I think off waivers from the Phillies very early in his career as a young minor leaguer, and he shows up at Vero Beach and in the second season of Vero Beach and sees hundreds and hundreds of minor leaguers who did not have names. They had colors and numbers. And this is the guy who wanted nothing more than to make a name for himself. Within 24 hours, he had requested a trade. He didn't want to be part of that system. And he got laughed at and said, no, you stick around. And he did stick around. I mean, he stuck around for decades. Sticking around was something he was enduringly capable at. Yeah,
he's still sticking around. I mean, if there had been an opening day last week, you could have bet that Tommy would have been there. And he would have gotten a huge standing ovation, the likes of which nobody besides Vin Scully gets at Dodger games, even now.
Yeah, I mean, he's the bridge. He's the bridge back to Brooklyn. He pitched for the Brooklyn Dodgers very briefly. Vin is the bridge back to Brooklyn, and they've seen literally every moment of the LA Dodgers history. It's remarkable when you think about that kind of longevity.
It is. I mean, the Dodgers moved to LA in 1958. We're talking 62 years. 62 years since Chavez Ravine.
Yes, and just for the record, you will be talking about that in this very space in the very near future. So I'm not
absolutely
about it.
Did you, when you kind of were researching and learning about that aspect of it, one thing that was fascinating to me is you quote Fernando as saying, "I didn't know anything about it. I never knew about it." And when I started my book, which covers the subject of how Dodger Stadium got built for everybody out there, I kind of early on really wanted to do a book that sort of mirrors the earlier chapters of Bled Blue. That was both a Fernando book and a kind of 50s LA book about Dodger Stadium. And I kind of realized quickly that I wasn't going to get Fernando to participate in a meaningful way. I took this very ill-fated trip to Etchawakia, his hometown in Sonora, in which like my rental car got damaged and I had to pay a bribe to a cop. I mean, it was like a giant nightmare. Like everything that could go wrong would go wrong. I did get to see some baseball in the Winter League, but did you like? I guess I'm not really sure what my question is anymore.
All right, well, stop at that thought because I actually want to ask you about Etchawakia. Like, what did you see there?
Not much. It's a very small town. It's off a kind of a big north-south highway between Obregon and Navajoa, two Sonoran cities that, are baseball towns, and they're kind of industrial, agricultural cities. It's, you've been to the Central Valley in California. You live in the East Bay. It kind of reminds you of that. It's when I was there, I wouldn't have described it as dusty. I'd have described it as muddy. The ground was literally muddy. Kind of this like fertile soil and quiet dirt roads, little convenience stores. I went to, there's one nice house there. There's the Valenzuela house, and I knocked on the door and nobody answered. There's a baseball field with, the outfield fence is made out of old tires, like half tires, like kind of half circles alongside each other. It wasn't, particularly great or terrible. It was just sort of there. A few stray dogs, pretty much just a really small agricultural town in Mexico. You would not know that it was Fernando Valenzuela's hometown. There was not a giant sign that says, home of El Toro. I did get to talk to some old sports writers from the nearby towns, and they had a lot of stories to tell about Fernando. And they talked a lot about, for some reason, so in the book you explained kind of how Mike Brito signs Fernando. And these guys were very insistent that Corrido Verona, the other Cuban scout, who you mentioned in the book, was really the guy who discovered him and didn't get enough credit. And they felt a strong need to correct the record. But I actually thought it was interesting in Bled Blue, you explained that Verona discovered him first, but nobody listened to him. And then Brito came along, and that was when people started to say, okay, we need to listen to this guy.
Right. I think part of it was that Brito was so insistent. He started tracking Fernando and filing regular reports. He didn't just say, here's a great player, and give the Dodgers the chance to ignore the report.
Right.
He took to calling Al Campanis directly until Campanis came down to see him himself.
And then he really like put his job on the line and yelled at Al Campanis to make him top an offer from the Yankees.
Yeah, a late breaking offer from the Yankees. It's really interesting. And it occurs to me how you would describe Etchoaquila, Fernando's hometown, as muddy and not, well, I described it as dusty.
Well, at the time I was there. I don't know how it is all year round.
But here's what I'm realizing is that, Fernandomania hit in early May, at which point by late May, early June, all the reporters were going to Etchoaquila to find out about Fernando, and it was probably a very dry time.
Yeah, I was there in December.
Story after story. Like how it was.
And that changes, and had they come in a different time of year, the whole way the town gets written about changes.
That's right.
It's very hard to imagine. Well, kind of easy to imagine this small town being infiltrated with like 30 reporters at once.
Yeah, and as quiet as Fernando is, his family is, as you saw, is just as reticent. They really didn't want to talk very much. They spoke to the first couple of reporters, at least some of them did, and after that, it was just like, you can leave us alone now, please. And
yeah, I mean, I can't blame them. Not everybody wants to have a reporter knocking on their door all the time. And as for you, I don't know, for me as a reporter, I try to be at least conscientious of the fact that when someone talks to me and tells me their story or whatever it is, that they're kind of putting their trust in my hands a little bit. And I could see why I would, if somebody didn't speak my language and was sort of pointing a camera in my face, I might not want to trust them.
That's true. And add on top of that Fernando's father was very much like Fernando. He came up to visit his son in 1981 to see him pitch, and he didn't say anything to anybody. They're a very, very quiet family. So you can imagine how they would respond to suddenly all these gringos coming in trying to talk to them about things they didn't really understand or want to understand.
It's sort of beautiful that now Fernando is a commentator on the radio for the Dodgers in Spanish.
Yeah,
the famously quiet person now talks for a living.
Exactly. So, I mean, this is the biggest, one reason I'm happy to talk to you is the most important facet of this team is what Fernando did for the Los Angeles Mexican community. Because, I mean, we won't go too in depth into Chavez Ravine itself, but, a fairly vibrant Mexican community was cleared out in order to build the ballpark. And thereafter, the Dodgers could not acquire this fan base that they knew existed. They knew so many Mexicans were there. And the number I heard was that in 1981, there was a higher concentration of Mexicans living in Los Angeles County than in anywhere in the world outside of Mexico City. And the Dodgers were not able to attract them in sufficient numbers. And as Al Campana said, he wanted to find the Mexican Sandy Koufax, someone this demographic.
The idea of the Mexican Koufax is something that Walter O'Malley was talking about. I mean, from as soon as the team moved to LA, that was in his initial vision. I mean, he brought in not the first ever Spanish language radio broadcast. I mean, the Brooklyn Dodgers had some Spanish language radio broadcasts, but he hired Rene Cardenas and Pepe, not Pepe Iniguez now, but Jaime Jardín to broadcast the team in Spanish right away. I mean, Jardín started in 59, he's still going. The Dodgers really were conscientious of tapping into all markets, just from a straight business perspective. They knew that there were people who liked baseball and spoke Spanish, and they wanted them to come to games. I'm not sure how much of their lack of engagement with Mexican fans was straight up, we're mad at you. I don't know, but I would say that there was a fair amount of apathy before Fernando. And I think it's interesting that Fernando, and you hit on this in the book, he didn't just bring in Mexican and Mexican-American fans. He brought in everybody. Not like every kind of fan that wasn't coming to Dodger games, all of a sudden is coming to Dodger games. And you have this he kind of kindled interest in this team that had been there for 2 decades and had been really good the whole time. Like the Dodgers of the 60s and 70s were good teams almost every year. And yet they hadn't reached this kind of cultural place in LA that only Fernando Valenzuela seems like he could have brought him to.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, they'd been to the World Series in 74, 77, and 78. We're now in 1981. And I mean, they'd set attendance records year after year. It seemed like every year the Dodgers were bettering their previous attendance record, which, for the major leagues. and somehow Fernando still activated this outpouring of joy with a Hispanic flavor. And everyone I talked to who was there was just in awe of it. And one of the reporters said it was so great because it was in no way the creation of the team's marketing department. It was completely organic. People bought in on their own accord, and there was plenty to buy into. And one benefit of the paperback that the hardcover does not have is it was a short list of things that people were selling outside the stadium, like Fernando posters and whatnot. And there's a button that said, "I live in the San Fernando Valley," with the San crossed out.
Right? Oh, that's funny.
Which is cute. And I wrote that, and it was in my text. And the typesetter took the strike through to mean he should get rid of the word San.
I noticed that. I was like, in the Fernando Valley? Is that a joke about the valley?
Nope. It was a misprint. So that's corrected in the paperback.
I'm glad it's corrected.
Yeah.
Did you keep the ridiculous photo of Fernando and Tommy Lasorda?
Yes.
Sombreros in the paperback too?
You know what? Actually, the paperback doesn't have the end papers. So
those are good.
So no, this is one benefit. The hardcover has this end paper photo of Fernando and Tommy.
The joy on Fernando's face is so good in that picture.
Yeah. Yeah, and the open collared shirt with the big gold medallion. It's fantastic. And the front end paper is Dusty Baker sliding in stadium. I gave Dusty the book. It was actually at a Cal baseball game. He was there to watch his son Darren. And he looks at first thing he opens is the front end paper. He's like, "Hey, that's me." That was an unexpected level of delight.
That's cool. I mean, it's also a great photo. You get the triangle roofs of the bleachers at Dodger Stadium and the palm trees in the background, and the whole atmosphere. Did your opinion about the Dodgers organization change much as a sworn Dodger hater growing up? I mean, you grew to admire them, but did you do you feel differently after doing this book? People have asked me that, and I'm curious what your opinion is.
I still admire them. I mean, they know what they're doing. They have a consistently good product on the field. They have a consistently stout organization in the front office. The Dodgers are insular. They didn't want to help with outreach much. They have a team historian, Mark Langell, who is fantastic. I met with him, had a lot of back and forth. He helped me a lot from his office. But in terms of getting in touch with players, they were not interested in helping. In terms of promoting the book at the stadium, they were not interested.
Oh, that's surprising.
Yeah, I had one of their VPs who's in charge of this thing tell me in an email, "It's really too bad. I think our fans would really enjoy this book. We just don't do this kind of thing." All right, well, too bad for your fans, I guess. But they have this kind of air of being above the fray, which in many ways they deserve. But as an outsider looking for help, I was pretty much on my own, which is fine. I mean, that's their right, and I have a job to do. Yeah,
absolutely. I was also on my own, as you could probably guess, based on the subject matter of my book.
Yeah. I mean, did they help in any way for you?
No. I've covered the team a fair bit for magazines and stuff, and always had really good relationships with the press people there. Everybody's always been really respectful to me and nice and helpful, within reason. And I kind of inquired. I said, "Hey, I'm writing a book about the subject. I was just, kind of wondering, wanted you guys to know, and maybe, we could set up some interviews with some people at some point," in a very vague kind of like feeling out fashion. And they kind of just said, like, "Let us know if there's anything specific you need." But then they weren't really responding to emails after that. It was the team historian didn't respond to my inquiries. And I think that's probably because of the subject matter, I would have to imagine. Although I will say that the O'Malley family was responsive, and Peter O'Malley's office was great. And even though this is a subject that they obviously feel very sensitively about, justifiably, and they might not love the finished product of the book, although I think it was a pretty fair portrayal of what happened. And it wasn't just about the Dodgers at all. It was really much more about the city and county governments and bigger political issues at the time. But Yeah, the O'Malleys were willing to open stuff up to me a little bit, but the Dodger organization was not.
Yeah, well, it helps that he no longer owns the team, Peter
That's
O'Malley.
true.
And he was great with me too. You know, I actually had very low expectations that I would ever get to talk to him, and he made himself very available.
That's cool. It's interesting. I mean, because the so much of the Dodgers legacy still is tied up, and we're 3 ownership groups away, right? We've had Fox, we've had the McCourts, and now we have the Guggenheim syndicate. And like, but so much of Dodger history and so much of like Dodger tradition and culture is still O'Malley era Dodger baseball. Branch Rickey and O'Malley really like continue to be the lodestones of the kind of corporate and team culture of the Dodgers.
Yeah, and given the various groups that have owned the team since the O'Malleys, between
That's fair.
Courts, I see how people are longing for the old days. At least in the kind of ether of the zeitgeist. And I'm sure they're happy with the product on the field. But
I was going to say it's pretty hard to argue with how they performed. I mean, you would like them to win a World Series if you're a Dodger fan, but they're really good every year.
Council, they've already won 2.
What's that?
According to the LA City Council, they've already won 2 World Series.
Oh, can you believe they did that? That's outrageous. Like, I don't understand why anybody would think that Dodger players or Dodger fans would want a like backwards default World Series trophy. It's the saddest thing you could ever get. It's like the worst gift.
It is. It's kind of it strikes me as reminiscent of something I would think when I was a Giants fan back in the 80s and my teams were terrible every single year. Like that was the kind of thing I would dream about. Like, can't we just back our way into a championship?
It's like when you're in Little League and the other team doesn't show up, so you win by forfeit.
Yay. Man, if the Dodgers win this year, no one is ever going to think about those other 2 ever again.
If the Dodgers win this year, everybody's going to think the Dodgers didn't deserve it because it was a shortened year, and it doesn't really count. And they're going to have that to contend with. Although, you know what? 81 was a shortened year, and I will tell you, no Dodger fan is ever like, well, we feel less about that World Series because of the strike.
Oh, they can't, because without that strike, the Dodgers don't even make the playoffs.
Nope, they sure don't. They sure don't.
Yeah, it was a remarkable season in so many ways, and the strike is just right in the heart of it all. The Reds finished with the best record in the National League and did not make the playoffs.
Did you have any temptation to just like go off the reservation and start writing about all the other crazy stuff that was happening in baseball that year? Because it was a lot.
It was a lot, and I mean, I've turned in 300,000 words once in my life. I didn't need to do it again. And also, Jeff Katz wrote the book Split Season.
Right.
A big overview about this book and about the season. It's a great book. He was actually nice enough to give me his unedited and very heavily annotated draft manuscript, so I could kind of see where all his information was sourced.
Oh, cool. Can I ask you a question about that, actually? A writer-to-writer question?
Sure.
I'm impressed by people who can do those sentence-by-sentence annotated references in a very organized way, like you did. How do you organize your sources while you write, and how do you kind of maintain your sanity about where information is kept and where it goes, and not lose sight of the actual writing while citing?
Yeah, I mean, I keep the citation to everything I do with the quote itself, so they're never separated. It's a 6-month process of research. It's a 12-month process of research. Whatever it is, it takes me inevitably probably close to 3 months just to organize everything. And those are inevitably the worst 3 months of the whole project. It is so dreary and mind-numbing just taking little chunks and moving it around. I mean, I kind of figure out where I want things to go. Some of it's chronological, some of it's individual stories within the chronology, but I kind of move these chunks around into folders on my hard drive, so I know where the information is when I start writing that chapter, and it's all accessible. And actually looking through the compiled information for a given section will give me lots of ideas about where to take it and what directions to go. So it's a dreary task, but it's absolutely essential for me.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I found to be the biggest challenges writing a nonfiction book, a historical book, was, and I've written historical magazine articles, but that's so different. I just told myself at first, well, it'll be like writing 10 long features in a row. It's not. It's a whole different thing. It's a different way of thinking about information, having all these balls that you're juggling and everything is in the air, and you have to make sure that you catch them all in the right order. Otherwise, the whole kind of narrative and the whole story just collapses.
Yeah. You do an hour-long interview, and end up cutting it into chunks that are sometimes several paragraphs long and sometimes one sentence long, and just moving them around in various folders so I can find them when I need them. It's I'm a little surprised that I was able to do it the first time, but once you do it, it becomes kind of second nature.
Well, I think that is probably going to be my last question for you. Is there anything else that I should know about the paperback edition of Bled Blue? Is there anything different in it from the hardcover?
Yeah, well, I mean, thank you, readers. There are obviously always going to be a few little mistakes, calling a right-handed pitcher a left-hander, things like that that you will always hear about.
I've found a couple of those in my book already that I'm disheartened by, but they're mine. I own them.
Yeah, of course. And it's crazy how thorough the copy editors in this business are. I mean, with Houghton Mifflin Harcourt especially, they're really, really good and very thorough, and they catch things I never would have thought to catch. And still, there's like more mistakes than I would care to acknowledge come through in the final text. So those, at least all that I've been able to find, have been corrected. In the first place.
Yeah.
The book is out. I think this is going to post on Tuesday. It's out today. So race out and get it. One of our goals here at Pandemic Baseball Book Club is to drive traffic to independent bookstores. So there will be a link to IndieBound, which will take you to an indie bookstore near you. And there may be some other bookshop links below as well.
Yeah, go get it. Bled Blue in paperback, available today. Today is tomorrow now.
We're actually talking on Monday. Shh! Don't tell anyone.
I'll keep it to myself.
And I'm really looking forward to hearing you talk about Stealing Home at some point in the very near future.
Very near.
All right. Hey, thank you, Eric. It was great talking to you.
Thanks, Jason.
All right.
I don't know what I'm pressing right now.